I'm a little disappointed that no one came in costume. But maybe some of us are in costume, but our costumes are not recognizable as such. But anyway, thank you for braving the holiday and coming to what I think will be a fascinating talk by Juliane Fürst, who is a senior lecturer in modern European history at the University of Bristol, but is in her third year of residency here in the United States, I believe. Last year was a fellow at the Davis Center. And I've been reading her work for quite a while. This is her second book, Stalin's Last Generation, Soviet Post-War Youth and the Emergence of Mature Socialism, with a great picture of people dancing. Is it Red Square?
It's just outside the Bolshoi, I think. Outside
the Bolshoi. People dancing after the war. I think we should all have pictures of people dancing on our covers. I'm very disappointed that Yanni's book on taxation does not have dancers. But my hope is that Kotkin Stalin biography will. Before this, she wrote her first book, Late Stalinist Russia, Society Between Reconstruction and Reinvention, from Routledge 2006. This is from Oxford 2010. And since then she's been focusing on alternative cultures and late socialism, with special attention to the Soviet hippie community, which I'm sure many of us who are old remember encountering in our times in our visits to the Soviet Union. So her talk today is called Flowers Through Concrete, Explorations of Soviet Hippie Land, which my word check kept changing to Hippo Land.
That's actually the working title of the book. So the talk is called Love, Peace and Developed Socialism, a short course in the history of the Soviet hippie movement in Systema. And it's actually, that's the title, rather lengthy title, of my first chapter for the book I'm writing. Yes, so I'm actually treating you to a sort of kind of overview of the history of the hippies, which really was a rather sort of painstaking exercise to get to know, because I started with a completely blank canvas. I mean, there were a couple of people who knew there were hippies, and obviously there were a few sort of memoirs and a couple of internet resources. But as I very soon realized, the hippies themselves don't know their history particularly well. They always know a bit they have lived through, and like every temporary witness believed that this was the full or the only truth. So this is the result of about 100 interviews I've conducted over 8 years probably, where I've been going back and forth to the ex-Soviet Union, Israel, America. In fact, 2 of my interviews live right here in New York, and have tried to reconstruct what actually happened to the hippies, and to separate a little bit myth from the fact, and put it into a historical context. So in a way, I'm giving you a relatively descriptive paper with a sort of appendix of what my interpretation is, because the real interpretive chapters are the following ones. But I felt that I had to give, for the book, I have to give once actually the groundwork, the facts of it I'm working, since this is sort of really terra incognita. So about the title, so rather convoluted, Love, Peace and Developed Socialism, which is meant to jar a little bit. I mean, love and peace are very nice concepts, and developed socialism is a little bit more questionable. And I think even Brezhnev probably didn't think it was to be a romantic notion. And then, of course, the second one is an allusion to, of course, Stalin's short course of the history of the Bolshevik Party. And why combine these two? And the reason really is sort of lies a little bit what can be seen in that second picture here, which is one of the people's book the Soviet hippies produced, actually in imitation of People's Book Day, which was only in 500 copies in the United States, and one of his copies miraculously made its way to Leningrad, and then they modeled all their pictures on that. But this is a people's book from a guy called Sasha Podoshnik, and you can see it's a montage, Milsha Rabota Zavtra Chevsovonia, which is of course an inversion of the communist doctrine. And I always felt that if the hippies had ever written their history, which they never have, because they actually wrote very little at all, they probably would have called it something like the short course of the history of the Soviet hippie movement, because it shows a little bit of that love, peace, and hippiedom and developed socialism were in this bizarre dialogue or communication in which they rejected, differentiated, aped, imitated, alienated, or tried to escape each other. But could never quite get away. It's of course also what Alexei Yurchak has described in his book, The Practice of Stjop. But I think for the Soviet hippie community in particular, it characterizes both the ironic detachment from Soviet society, but also the historical pathos, the sincerity and teleological belief with which they nonetheless defined themselves. So it is always half serious, half joking, half imitating, and half rejecting. And that very well actually describes in a nutshell that sort of whole relationship between love, peace, and developed socialism, and which I hopefully can convey a little bit in the next few pictures and minutes. So I start with inspiration, and this is a sort of rather lengthy part because this is the only time in the book where I will speak about the sort of antecedents of the Soviet hippies, but also because it is very important to understand of why Soviet hippies could come about. And the first reaction I usually still get when I say I write about Soviet hippies is, oh, where they're any. As Elliot said quite rightly, actually, everybody who went to the Soviet Union in the 1970s or 80s could have seen them because the hippies assembled on Gorky Street, on very visible places. But even most Russians who lived through this period are not aware that they existed, partly because they didn't want, they weren't supposed to be there, and therefore they were silenced out of the sort of narrative of late socialism that is usually told, but after all they are part of this narrative, and in many ways I would say they define this particular field of late socialism insofar as they are the most outlying community that is possibly there, but and therefore they give the parameters what was possible in late socialism. So the Soviet hippie community, it started probably around somewhere 1967, 68 in a couple of places simultaneously, most notably of course in Moscow, and I will go into the Moscow story a little bit more in detail, but also in the Baltic cities, and here the inspiration was probably more Western influenced than it was in Moscow and Leningrad, but I've had single people telling me of stories of being a hippie in Magadan in the late 60s, or in Novosibirsk. There was a large hippie community in Irkutsk. So it seems like as if in these early periods there were a lot of people who imitated a Western lifestyle they knew about to more or less success, and then faded away. And the communities which I still know about are usually the communities which have existed then for longer and kept on existing until the 80s. In Magadan, and literally they drifted in and drifted out of the lifestyle when it became too hot, which is again something I will talk about later in the early 70s. So in a way it's impossible to write a full and comprehensive history of the hippie movement. I think you would have to collect interviews for 100 years and then everybody would have died you wanted to talk to. And therefore this is still always a snippet of what was there. The hippies themselves are absolutely incapable of explaining what came over them and why they suddenly started to paint flowers over on their faces and on their trousers. And the most common answer I get is it was simply in the air. And there is actually sort of something in it. But of course it is no coincidence that the Soviet hippie movement could come about. It's a confluence of factors, both internal and external, and I'm sort of going to try to disentangle this a little bit. Therefore, by 1969, we have a summer of love here represented by hippies in Palanga, who were actually hippies from Kaunas. I think they look quite respectable already at this early stage. So when does a hippie actually become a hippie, which is sort of one of the questions I had to ask myself relatively early on in my research. And again, people are very vague about it. Some people have a sort of epiphany moment. For example, Kolya Vassin, who is now famous as the guardian of the Lenin Temple in St. Petersburg, in Pushkinskaya District. He says, the day after I first saw the cover of Abbey Road, I took off my shoes and went walking around Leningrad barefoot. That was my challenge, my attempt at self-expression. So there were sort of moments where suddenly there was a eureka moment and they did something which was so outside the norm that is defined for them being a hippie. But of course, for most of the people, it was more a gradual process of alienation from the mainstream, drifting into a new peer group of youngsters, and for many of them, the journey started with music. For others, it was more of search for meaning in a way of life that offered an escape from the petrified party state. Of course, being a hippie was as much about being identified by others as a hippie than having that identity than oneself. But as every person had a very individual path to hippodom, most communities in the Soviet Union had also their very particular paths. However, the irony is that for most people all across the Soviet Union, the Soviet media played a huge role in introducing people to the Soviet hippie community. So this is the very first mentioning of the Soviet press of hippies in nonetheless Pravda from the 5th of June of 1967, and it's impossible to read, of course, but it was an actually rather sympathetic article about young people who were anti-capitalist, anti-American, and pro-Vietnam. And while they were a little bit misguided, this was something to be supported. Oh, sorry, anti-Vietnam. Yeah, pro-Vietnam in terms of supporting the Vietnamese people, which is actually interesting because in the Soviet press it is framed as pro-Vietnamese rather than anti-Vietnam war. The next article actually was in Ravesnik about flower children without color. Which was about the London hippies, but the most impressive or most long inspiring article was in my book Swifter by Genrich Bondrich, Travel into the Hipland, and you can see this was about the New York hippies, but also about Woodstock, and there's an interesting backstory to the article, because Baravich was in New York with his teenage daughter, and she was friendly with a guy called Sergei Patufrin, and they were both only 13 years old, and he got the call from Moscow to write an article about the hippie movement, and him being a good Soviet apparatchik, he actually didn't know very much about hippies, and he actually then turned to his teenage daughter and her friend and said, "Can you help me writing this article?" And they directed him into the East Village and to Woodstock, and he wrote this rather melancholic piece about children who have fallen out with their parents and who have enough of the lifestyle in a rich bourgeois country. And you can even see from the picture, it's all actually not unappealing, and this article really became a sort of kind of program for the Soviet hippie movement. Almost every single Soviet hippie interviewed has read this article, even many years after, because it sort of became a sort of Samizdat item, was photocopied or copied by hand and circulated in the hippie community. Interestingly, so this is the original People's Book from California, which was handmade and then printed in 500 copies. And that made it into Leningrad, by which way I don't know. But as you can see, this is only one of about 10 or 12 People's Books I have seen. This is a People's Book by a guy from Lvov. And they very faithfully copied the design, the name, the layout, even the kind of text that was accompanying it. So we have a very direct transnational transfer between one culture to the other to a certain extent. So this is Sergei Patufrin, who then as a 16-year-old returned back to Moscow, already pretty much a full-blown hippie, and he got integrated into the Moscow hippie community and supplied them with a lot of know-how together with another returning diplomat's daughter called Masha Stadnitzer. Her real name actually was Isvikova, Stadnitzer of course from the name Stati, and that already shows the hippies quite often were very keen on their nicknames or on their monikers, and one of the difficulties when tracing or trying to trace down these networks was that people never actually knew what anybody was really called or where they were from. All they knew was the moniker, and when people decided to fade back into civilian life, all they had to do was basically drop that nickname and it disappeared from the community. And that actually happened with Maria Isvikova. According to one of my interviews, he later on saw in a fancy hotel and she had married a Soviet diplomat and gone back to the world she came from. But she had brought back a whole lot of beads and pictures and knowledge of how to be a hippie before she did that. And the other interesting moment in Moscow was that, of course, this was a community of very privileged youngsters. In fact, very, very privileged. Among them was Vasily Stalin, who was Stalin's grandson, and all of the Orchonikidze and Mikoyan grandchildren. And everybody else also had parents either in the Central Committee or in the KGB. In fact, the KGB was very well represented because they traveled abroad quite a bit and they would bring back the necessary music paraphernalia. including in fact the leader of the Moscow hippie community, a guy nicknamed Somse, in real life Yura Borakov, whose father was a KGB general by rumor, I've never quite verified that, and his brother was a Komsomol activist. So one can see how within one family the roads divide. But they would hang out in the Mayakovsky Square, which was right adjacent to the Czech embassy. And then they became friendly with the youngsters of the diplomats who were the Czech diplomats, and they started climbing over the wall into the Czech embassy because the Czech had better access to music and to articles, and they would sit in the cellar where there was a bar and watch Czech films and read these rock and roll journals. And what is the interesting thing about this is of course 1968, so the Prague Spring is in full flow, but none of these youngsters in the cellar speak about reforms. All they talk about is the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, and so one can see this the shift away from the sort of fourth generation non-conformism, which is very much politically orientated, very much reform orientated, towards a non-conformism which is happening on a completely different level. And I always find it sort of particularly symbolized by this episodes where they're sitting in the cellar while basically one of the biggest sort of events on the world stage is unfolding right above them. And not a word was exchanged about what was happening to the Prague Spring. Of course, when it then all ended, all the diplomats are recalled and the Czech embassy closes for a time. And in return, however, another very influential young man came back from Prague, Artemy Tolsky, who is by now known as a very famous rock critic, and he also brought back a whole lot of music, and this is how the Moscow hippie community started to develop. This is sort of a picture of one of the central groups of people from which the Moscow hippie community originated, not yet very much hippie. In the very center with the eyeglasses is a guy called Sasha Barodulin, who was also the son of a famous photographer. The girl in the coat with the cap, she is Tatiana Strelnikova, the daughter of the Pravda correspondent in New York. So you'll see in Moscow in particular, it went via these sort of high elite connections, which just offer that little bit better access to Western information, to kickstart a movement that became the Soviet hippie community. However, there's also, of course, another side to the hippies, another side to the origins of the hippie community worldwide, which is the beatnik culture, which of course was particularly important here in the US, but also if one looks at the Soviet context, it is not that this transition from reformist-orientated, literary-orientated, non-conformist youngsters towards the hippies was one which was a complete rejection from one thing into the other. On the contrary, a lot of the very early hippies, including, these are three sort of very important leaders. Ophelia, who was also daughter of a KGB spy. Her mother had been an undercover agent in England during the war. And she therefore spoke very good English, not because she lived there, but because her mother taught her. And this is Sveta and Alexandra Markov, who basically ran the first hippie commune in Moscow from about 68 onwards from their flat in Prospect Mira. And all three of them actually were associated to smog. Well, depending on the transliteration, on the Same Молодое общество гениев or Smysl Mudrost Oblast i Globina. And I think smog already has a lot of that sort of split personality which characterized the Soviet hippies. Again, already in the name, on the one hand, a sort of ironic attachment. We are the youngest society of genius, or we are thought, wisdom, image, and depth, which of course was a sort of earnest side to them, and they never quite actually identified which of the two transliterations they preferred. They were coming out directly out of the Mayakovsky readings in the late 50s, when young poets would assemble under the Mayakovsky monument in Moscow and read poetry, initially official poetry, and then more and more their own poetry, and then it became to literally physical clashes with the Komsomol patrols, and 3 people were arrested, Kuznetsov, Osipov, and Bockstein, who, and of course Kuznetsov becomes later on a sort of famous refusenist, tries to hijack a plane to fly to Leningrad, gets sentenced to death and becomes one of the sort of cause célèbres for the West. But just to sort of see a little bit the kind of peerage and heritage where these people come from. And of course, the Mayakovska becomes the meeting point for the hippies. Some of them claim they knew the history, that it had been the sort of place of nonconformism in Moscow. Some say it was coincidental. But they all actually refer back to Mayakovsky as a sort of inspiration, who was a huge inspiration for the third generation, as somebody who was sort of revolutionary and nonconformist, and therefore symbolized a little bit their peculiar situation as feeling anti-Soviet, but actually having an ideology which was not at all in contradiction to a lot of what, of course, communist official ideology was. So anyway, these three actually were linked to Smog, went to their readings, and unfortunately all of them, Ophelia is dead, Sveta Markov probably too, and Alexandra Markov I could never locate. They emigrated to San Francisco in the mid-70s. So I don't quite, I'd be interested if there was any conscious decision to reject the kind of poetic circles and beatnik community and go a hippie style, or if there was an unconscious one, but the result basically was this commune, or this sort of very open flat in Perspektiva, where basically from about the late 60s onwards, everybody who was in any way bohemian in Moscow would assemble, especially rock musicians, underground artists, and the sort of new breed of the hippies. In other places there was a similar and even more direct development. This is in Riga, where there was a very famous cafe called the Cafe Casa, named after the only filter brewing coffee machine in town. And one of its central figures is the guy in the pictures, Eisen Sivanov. And he also describes how the sort of beatnik culture was the beginning of re-engaging after actually a break after the sort of early years of the Styliani with Western culture. And he says, we had the ability to reconstruct everything out of fragments. I knew that Carriage existed. I knew that Allen Ginsberg existed. That they listened to jazz, smoked grass. We knew that they wore big jumpers, that they had slightly longer hair, that they smoked, that even the girls smoked. I even used to ask, how can you not smoke? For us, it was this romantic picture. Our thinking was ready for this. So the Cafe Casa became the place for the bohemians of Riga, and among them, very similar again as to Moscow, was a guy called Andres Grillenberg, who was a little bit of a crazy person. And his description of him at the time was, I don't dress in that way, and I liked the public there in the casa. And I went there, and they took me in like theirs, because I had an image which they valued. But then I got all tired of it, and all of that seemed not interesting to me. And I got interested in these young people who wore their hair long, and I started to make clothing for them, design hippie. And here is sort of the link which creates a vibrant hippie community in Riga. And his juxtaposition in the interviews was very much, he left the life in the casa, which was more intellectual, for one which was more visible. And that really became one of the hippie hallmarks, that they broke out of this cafe and quartier, this campagna culture, and started to assemble in public places, therefore directly challenging, of course, the public monopoly of the mainstream. The other distinction was that compared to, for example, the third generation, which listened very much to either jazz or the bards, their music was very much directed to a sort of kind of elsewhere. And the biggest influence, sorry, that I forgot. This is the transition period in Tallinn. Sasta Medontov, who was the son of the second party secretary. And he later on became the leading hippie in Tallinn. And so you see the hair is still short, but the clothing is definitely going in the right direction. And that is Vova Zaitsev in Leningrad, who became one of the founders of the Beatlomania, of the Beatles movement. And even though it's a complete cliche, but really it is true that one cannot exaggerate the importance the Beatles played in the creation of the hippie movement, and in general of an alternative rock scene in the USSR. So his said, Vova Zaitsev, he described when hearing Can't Buy Me Love, is that it seemed to me that in the expression of the Beatles' faces, there was some sort of freedom and openness, which expressed what he really believed, and that was really, really cool. So the Beatles start to symbolize the sort of cult of a sincerity which goes beyond the supposed sincerity of the mainstream, which of course by this stage in the 1970s was not at all seen as sincerity anymore, as demonstrated by the sort of Stjop and the banner. So it was basically the escape from a world which didn't seem sincere anymore at all, because everybody was either detached or cynical, into a world which still offered a true and real sincerity. So the shift that came in the late 60s and 1970s, and for example in Estonia, the hippie casters, hippies, this is first and foremost long hair. But long hair came already with the Beatles, and they were not really hippies. But there was no such strict differentiation. Hippie, this is hitchhiking, guitar playing, rock and roll, drugs, free love. This active hippie life started somewhere in 1970. In 1970, for the first time, Russian hippies came to Tallinn, who were simply not music lovers, but who conducted a real hippie lifestyle. They were vagabonds who could only sleep in the park on a tent, and who most importantly, who took drugs. Our melomani, which were the sort of music dealers, they drank beer and listened to rock and roll. So in 1970, there is the first attempt to reach out to hippies elsewhere, and especially the Baltic hippies had always been aware that there were hippies in the other Baltic towns, and they had started to visit each other. And Alexander Lobodontov, who we've seen in the Interesting Trousers before, and his friend Arne Lloyd in Tallinn organized the first hippie congress, and they indeed called it the Siest Hippie. And they sent out invitation, and so again, I guess there was a certain irony in it, but there was no other form of assembly that was known to them. If you had to meet, that clearly was coming together, and what better word was there than Congress. As it happens, the KGB were already on their tail, and they got not quite arrested, but they were sort of taken in for questioning. And the hippies basically only became about 10 people, 5 of whom you can see here in a street in Tallinn, which was nicknamed Love Street. But it was the beginning of something more, which brings me to my second chapter, which is a second part called Systemification. Because interestingly, the hippies, just as they had a congress, they created very, very early on something which they called the Systema. It again originated in Moscow. It originated with Sonce. Initially was also known as Systema Sonce. In Moscow for a long time there were several Systema. There was the Smalskaya Systema, the Baumanskaya Systema, and the Centrality Systema, which was obviously the most important one, and anybody who was a serious hippie would gradually graduate from being in one of the local Systemas to going to the Centrality Systema, which was meeting either on the Pushkin Square or in the Psychodrom in the second courtyard of the Moscow University. And the idea of the Systema seems to have come about when the Moscow hippies for the first time ventured outside Moscow and went to Riga. So this is where they are in Riga in front of the cathedral. Again, only vaguely hippie yet, but for the late 60s, their dress was already pretty daring. When we look at the late 70s, we see that actually nobody would have batted eyelid at them anymore. But at the time, they were definitely outside the norm. And this sort of experience of finding other people who were hippies, actually coincidentally they went for a rock festival or a rock competition, because of course even rock music had to be done in that socialist competition way. Basically created that sense that they had to be larger than themselves, which of course in itself is also very much a sense which does not run counter-communist ideology, that they could not just exist per se, but they had to have a sort of larger missionary purpose and a larger community. So I've always asked people, why did you call it, of all things, Systema? And one answer I got was, it was a non-komsomol organization, an a-komsomolskaya organization, which of course in itself is a very socialist answer. The other explanation I got was they had their system, we had ours. Some people said it was a different system of values. It all basically describes the sense that you could not be a hippie in Adinochistry. You had to be in a community, and only then could your hippie potential be fulfilled. It took a long time actually for the Systema to become anything more than a sort of kind of little anecdote in sort of Moscow hippie history, but it was helped by the fact that from about the 70s, early 70s onwards, the officials became aware of what was happening in Moscow as well, and started to try to define what this group of people is. So for example, one of the very early documents where the hippies are described by the city committee of the Komsomol, it says, this is in 1970, a few months ago we could observe a group of young guys who were assembling at the street in the middle of Moscow, and they sang English and American songs, or for example the Marseillaise, with words like let there not be a war or revolution, love, love, love. So they started to realize, to sort of recognize them as a kind of new songs. They, according to one hippie, they created a Komsomol patrol on Gorky Street, which was designed to look out particularly for the hippies, and they had a big folder marked Hippie with one P initially, and I'm not quite sure if that is true, but it seems like a pretty good story. And in 1975, the Komsomol published a pamphlet for its patrols in which it had 3 pages on the hippies, in which it tried to explain of why these hippies are so dangerous. Because one of the problems was that the hippies would start to argue with the Komsomol patrols about how they were representing communist values better than officialdom, and a couple of Komsomol patrols actually changed sides and started to hang out with the hippies. So the pamphlet reads, if in the West the hippie movement appears as a passive protest against a pointless future, in our country the social direction of this movement is clearly reactionary, drawing youth away from active participation in communal life and production, in the swamp of petty bourgeoisie and bourgeois pacifism, and inducing a reactionary longing for the West while putting down our Soviet reality. All this raises the question of a lack of generations, or a question of fathers and sons. The reality was that actually the hippies, the Soviet hippies in particular, were not really a question of fathers and sons. I found very little real generational conflict in my interviews, which was partly due because the conflict to the regime was so dominant that there didn't need to be a generational conflict apart. And a lot of people actually describe how their mothers trailered their trousers and hosted their hippie friends when they didn't have any food. And there seems to be quite a lot of sort of hippie apartments or communes with sort of babushka attached to it. So while of course there was instances of parental conflict, and indeed the leader of the Moscow hippies movement, Sonze, he fell out with his KGB fathers, partly because of course his activities endangered his father's position. It was definitely not as prominent either in the rhetoric or the reality as it seems to have been in the West. With this sort of idea of the Systema came also an idea that the hippies had to do collective action. And the first one of these actions which I came across is what they call the Great Walk in 1969, in which very spontaneously, on actually what must have been a warmish November day, a group of Soviet hippies, Moscow hippies, took off their shoes and walked all the way down from Mayakovskaya to the Red Square, then across down to the Lenin Library, and then via back route back to Mayakovskaya, at which they were then collected by the KGB and put into buses and driven away. But all of this lasted for about 3 hours. Some people say there were about 300 to 400 people walking. They were singing, they had a guitar. And since it was the day of the tank driver, which just shows that any day in the Soviet calendar can be a holiday, and it had been pretty much exactly a year since the crashing down of the Prague Spring, some people said this was a sort of a march in protest of the Prague Spring, which luckily they don't seem to have said too loudly, because I think otherwise they wouldn't have got out the next day, which most of them did. But it established that basically front lines were now drawn, that the hippies were not anymore these slightly melancholic youngsters as portrayed early on in the Soviet press. And interestingly, the flow of press articles about hippies in the West stops in 1970 completely, only to be resumed in 1977 with a much more critical tone. And the next time the hippies organize something, they actually go about it in a very different way. So 1971, I think not everybody agrees, but they were inspired by the May Day protests in Washington, D.C., which were huge protest of basically counter-cultural anti-Vietnam War protesters, which lasted for 3 days, and which then sparked protests all around the world, anti-Vietnam War demonstrations. And Sun Tzu, the leader in Moscow, thought that Moscow hippies should also do something similar. And he actually, according to some sources, goes to the Gorotskaya Komitet and says we want to have a demonstration in support of Vietnam. And according to some people, he actually gets permission and he goes around and starts to rally people to come for this demonstration, which is supposed to meet outside the Moscow State University, the Psychodrome, which is this little area here, and then go all the way to the American embassy. Indeed, and there's somewhere between 600 to 3,000 people show up. It's difficult to establish. It's big enough that the Chronicle of Current Events, the underground dissident publication at the time, takes notice and has a little entry. Some people have signs saying "Make peace, not war." It was either provocation or the authorities changed their mind, but before the demonstration can even get off the ground, again there are these yellow buses supposedly, and they collect everybody, and this time people get sometimes arrested for 15 days, and about a year later a great number of them who got registered get called into the army and disappear to the Chinese border for 2 or 3 years. Supposedly there were about 3,000 arrests. I was never able to find a single document relating to this demonstration in one of the archives, which makes me think they're probably somewhere else because it was too big enough an event to not generate any documents. There's no, there's no doubt it took place. There are just too many witnesses for that. And that really is a watershed moment for the hippie movement in Moscow and for the hippie movement overall. The type of people who now, basically, until then the hippie movement was very much made up of students and of people who could be hippies as much as they wanted to. You could become a weekend hippie, you could become a Thursday hippie, you could become a full hippie. And it didn't make so much difference. The repercussions were relatively small. After that event, it became clear, people were expelled from the university, that you couldn't be a student and a hippie. And that basically meant that now segregation was taking part. If you now were a hippie, you were outside society. If you were inside society, all you could do is become a sympathizer, but you were not part of that systema, or only in a sort of very tendentious way, and the systema itself started to build rituals which made sure that only committed people would be considered really systemically. So here we have again Ophelia, who I've shown before with her new boyfriend. Ophelia had a whole lot of boyfriends as a cello, and they very much, their lifestyle very much represents the sort of prototype of hippie that now made up the Moscow community, but actually the Soviet hippie community overall. They worked as act models in one of the artist schools, which meant that they had the summer off, because in the summer they did different things. They were a group who were heavily into drugs. That is not true for all Soviet hippies. They lived basically nowhere anymore where they were registered. They lived either in these hippie communes, which didn't ever last very long, or with friends, but they were not really traceable anymore in the system because they were not working anywhere particularly stable, and they were not registered anywhere where they lived. So they existed slightly below the surface. It also, of course, meant that the hippie movement became, it was a harsher place. It never probably quite reached the numbers anymore it had in the early 70s, but it became more coherent inside. Skipping over a few things. Yeah, so this is actually a picture of Sun Tzu, who in 1972 is taken in Tallinn. The other thing that happened is that the hippies started searching for something more stable than just their own ideology, and this is when esotericism, mysticism, Russian Orthodoxy, at that moment there was an ecumenical congress in Tallinn, underground of course, and this is where the hippies went. So they were searching and probing all sorts of directions where they could find sort of greater encourage. So 72 also became another pivotal moment in Kaunas. This is the group of hippies who assembled in Kaunas around this fountain, which is interestingly just as in Moscow, where of course the Psychodrome and the Pushkinskaya are right in the center of town. This fountain is right opposite the party headquarters of Kaunas. So it's a little bit in the face of the authorities. And what happened then is that a guy who actually wasn't really part of them, but who was hanging around with them, but they were suspicious, they actually thought he was okay to be this guy, but he burned himself, Romas Kalampas, in 1972 and died with the sentence freedom for Lithuania, which of course then created a huge ruckus. And at his funeral, there were 2-day riots resulting from his funeral. The hippies by this time had all been arrested and weren't really part of it, but it cemented in the authorities' minds that the hippies were a subversive force. It also meant that the Systema became more and more an important part of actually sort of safeguarding one's own. And this is also another one of the Systema events, which wasn't really a Systema event, but which shows the sort of hardening of fronts between what is perceived as hippies and hippies. This is a concert in St. Petersburg, or in Leningrad, which supposedly Leningradskaya Pravda published a note saying that Santana, the Beach Boys, John Bass, Alla Pugacheva are going to come and sing. Yeah, no, I mean but of course it was published in Leningradskaya Pravda, so it must be true. And this piece of paper basically was sent around along these Systema network routes, saying this is happening in Leningrad. As has now become apparent, it was all part of a very elaborate film project, which was supposed to show a rock concert, and this rock concert had to happen in order to film it. The film then was cancelled, but everybody forgot to cancel the concert, so it was never published that this concert wouldn't happen. So on the day, which was ironically the 4th of July, thousands of youngsters show up on Palace Square and wait for this concert to happen. And when it doesn't happen, it actually, again, it comes to riots and barricades on Nevsky Square. And it's one of these episodes which the Soviet Union has managed to keep very quiet. That basically took 24 hours, and the army had to come in to re-establish order. Partly, and again, it was associated with the hippies. Actually, many of the sort of hippies I interviewed were not there, but it shows that they cannot be seen in isolation. It was their information networks, it was their the sort of groundwork delay which actually could lead to a situation in which 2,000 disappointed youngsters who couldn't see the Beach Boys start to riot against Soviet authorities. So this is sort of the new generation already of hippies, and this is an interesting moment in that movement. The Systema has always existed, but there are 3 people coming in really who decided something more has to happen as a Systema, and that the Systema offers a possibility of creating a parallel world which had not yet been exploited. So to the left is Gena Zaitsev, who's the brother of Oberzaitsev, the one with the baby and the Beatles, who had become sort of the main hippie in Leningrad with his girlfriend from Vilnius. Vilnius had so many hippie girls, was called Gobotny West. And Sergei Moskvalov, who was the leader by then of the hippies in Moscow, so also having basically drunk himself into stupor. He was still there, but by no means anymore a moving force. And then there was a 3rd person whose picture I couldn't find, called Misha Bombin in Riga. And they started to organize rituals for the hippie community. So, for example, they become more aware of their own history. That demonstration 1971 has already become a huge sort of mystic event. There are only very few hippies actually left who were part of that demonstration. But in 1978, decide on the 1st of June, which was the day of the demonstration, and also the day of the defense of the rights of children, which the hippies always considered their holiday because they are children too, they're flower children. Which again is sort of this half ironic, half serious. We are the innocent, but we are also detached. But anyway, they assemble around the Psychodrome and take these pictures, which I really have in this very grainy resolution. But they start to become aware that they have a history, and they start to celebrate that history. In addition, they start to try to have a place in the summer where they could all come to and assemble. And the first attempt is in 1978 in a place called Solnishnoye, which is near St. Petersburg, and that is the sort of gathering shot of the hippies in attendance. And really, there is only about 50 people who really make up the heart of the Systema, but around it are several thousand who in one way or the other are connected. They get kicked out of Socialism and have to move over to another place. However, before you see already this sort of mixture of all sorts of other influences, and there's a cross in the background, and then there's always a procession. There's actually even a film exists of this particular event, which looks a little bit spooky. That is already the next cross in the place where they go from there, which was Vigna. And then finally they end up in Gaia, which becomes the hippie summer camp from 1978 to 1987. Every year for 3 months the hippies gather in this place near Riga, and for some reason the KGB and the local police let them alone, maybe haven't figured out they can't prevent it anyway, and they sort of rather observe it. However, as part of course, these summer camps is that you have to travel to them, and travel becomes the central experience for the Soviet hippie, even more so, I would say, than for the Western hippie. And it has to do, of course, something about the idea of freedom in a society which they know very well is repressive, but also, of course, geographically limited. So they create their own Western travel routes within this limited space they have. So they go to Central Asia, which is their Shangri-La. They make the Baltics as the little Europe, and you start to reach certain stages of hippiedom by doing the certain circles. So you can do the small circle, which is just the circle of Riga, Leningrad, Moscow, hitchhiking, and then you have the entry step to hippiedom. Or you can do the larger circle, which takes in Lvov and all of the Baltic states. Or you can do the Grand Circle, which is of course in a way the Grand Tour, where you go to Central Asia. And if you are a little bit differently orientated, you go to the Altai or to Siberia. And of course, there's no coincidence I show you a row of pictures I have now about traveling, because this was where the hippies did take pictures, because this is of course where they felt most themselves, but also where they used these pictures to create this coherence when they returned back. So the traveling was both something which you did, but it was also important in its recounting. And of course you had to leave your mark. So this is actually a Moscow hippie, Gulliver from, but his girlfriend came from Carpathia in Lithuania. The sign says Asia, which you can't quite see, which always amused me that there actually is something like this on the border between Europe and Asia. This is the Moscow hippies who travel to Central Asia, and actually their accounts, of course, of when they travel is very interesting. That they are out there to look and find their Shangri-La, and part of it is motivated by this mysticism, but of course they come to Central Asia and they meet a society which actually is much less tolerant of their look than the Moscow crowd back home, and they also feel quite alien. So it is very much they travel around in these little groups looking at a piece of Soviet society they don't know, trying to identify people who are like them. But it's very much a colonial look they have, of course. This is meditation, and a sort of kind of easy brand of Eastern mysticism becomes very popular, and people went into the Altai to seek out shamans. So there's Greg from Lvov, and the top is Gina Zaitsev at one of the summer camps, and again Gulliver. And then there was a particular brand called the Lvov Moto Hippie, which really were bikers and easy riders, but because there wasn't much of an alternative scene, all of this became part of the Systema. The Systema, actually, when one looks at it, has no coherence whatsoever, except in its rituals and sort of calendar. But because there is only the alternative of being a square, a conformist, or a Systema, they will become part and parcel. And this is then in the Carpats, somewhere meeting the local babushkas. And then one of the main events of 1979, which really is sort of 78, 79, is sort of the heyday of activity. They decide, actually 78, they decide to go to Jasna Polana for Tolstoy's 150th birthday, I think, was it death day? birthday, yeah. But they refused entry because of the way they look. But of course it shows, again, another one of the more ideological antecedents. There were a great number of Tolstoyans among the hippies, some very active. And the rest of them sort of went along. If you speak to most of them, they had very little idea about the Tolstoyan idea, but it was sort of, it was in the greater realm, just like the Eastern mysticism and the Beatles, which sort of belonged all to that world, which was endlessly wide because it was so defined by being outside, and there's so many ways of being outside. And again, showing that on the one hand there was a very sort of move towards the systemification, to make the schema coherent, to having certain entry rituals, to having a network of information which was very much swaying. But there was always outreach. I mean, first of all, because the hippies could not live in a vacuum, they had to work in order to avoid parasite charges. But they also interacted in other aspects of their life with officialdom, sometimes not quite voluntarily. A lot of them end up in psychiatric hospitals for various spells. Some psychiatric hospitals seem to have been a little bit more benign than others. But for most of them it's a rather unpleasant experience. But for example, here in 1975, after the Bulldozer exhibition 1974, the criticism, the international criticism is so strong that it's decided an official non-conformist exhibition is going to be permitted, and that takes place at the WDNH. And one of the groups allowed to participate is Ophelia's sort of larger art collective called the Watershed. And the central piece is this hippie flag, which they Tyler, and I don't know which version that is, but basically the first flag says hippie of the world unite. And on the eve of the exhibition, the KGB comes and confiscates the flag, and says that and a couple of other pictures, but the flag really is a big scandalous piece. And overnight, they tailor a new flag, which they then guard for the duration of the exhibition, and it becomes a huge success. The exhibition is crowded, but again, it shows sort of the hippie community is not isolated. It belongs part of a larger underground, and also part of an underground that is in constant conversation with the overground, with the normal people. Interestingly, the other big scandalous exhibit of the exhibition is a nest, a family nest. It's a big bird's nest where there's a family sitting and it's a performance. And that stuff becomes the other, that is also confiscated because it's a fire hazard, according to the police. Which actually, I guess what happened here too. But it shows both the flag, the hippies of the world unite, and the nest, of course, it shows what the official level is afraid of, is this creation of alternative communities. Because the nest is also that sort of drawing inwards of a family sitting in a nest, which is an island. And the hippie flag, of course, is a banner under which people rally, and that are exactly the kind of exponents which basically fall foul of the official view. And it's only because there's so much Western press that basically both of them actually are allowed to exist. The group Watershed then gives a Newsweek interview. They have a 2 double-page spread in Newsweek, where they actually, which is interesting for a historian, because they tell all the things of how they're planning to do a hippie commune in Moldova, and how they're hippies in Siberia in a commune anyway. And then I spoke to a couple of people and they say, oh, we told this Newsweek journalist all these things, and we were just laughing our heads off, and he just believed everything. And of course I would have completely believed it too if I hadn't spoken to them. But it's again, it's sort of that game of, on the one hand, I think it symbolizes what they would have liked. They're telling the story, they're telling the sort of Soviet story they would have liked to have happened. So it isn't a straightforward lie. In fact, there was in the early 70s an attempt to create a Moldovan colchos only inhabited by hippies, which was one of these sort of schemes with the Komsomol before it was clear that the hippies were on the other side. But anyway, they have to escape. That, in fact, is the Grupa Watershed. You see them in their full splendor with Ophelia, her boyfriend Diktar Yuk, who was the Jimi Hendrix of Moscow, played in a band. In the middle is a guy who's now an Orthodox monk and icon painter. But anyway, this is startling because it's in color. They basically, the ground is too hot in Moscow, and they go down to the Crimea and live in a dacha of an artist called Kiselev, and stay there for half a year over the winter to sort of escape notice. And in terms of, there's another picture of Lvov and Polish hippies, and again I've included it because it's in color and it actually shows what one forgets when one always uses black and white pictures, that really they did stick out. There wasn't just, they were a little bit different, they were quite a good deal different. So that really was the high spot of the maturity years of the Systema. In 1980 there was a huge repression in the wake of the Olympics, or before the Olympics, to clean the streets of Moscow. But it didn't kill the Systema. In fact, it was still going very strong, probably with more people again in the mid-80s. And really their sort of turning point comes with Perestroika, when a lot of the things they did underground and have done underground for years start to become actually legal currency, or at least accepted currency, when they're suddenly the punks, unlike in the West where the punks and the hippies were diametrically opposed, the punks sort of become part of the hippie community, become part of the Systema, as I consider Systema Ludic. It's only then when sort of hip-hop, etc. arrives and actually does happen, sometimes even with Komsomol support on Moscow streets, that suddenly there seems to be no sense of a Systema anymore. There is no real dissolution, but in 1987 is the last camp of Gauer, and I think in 1988 people just didn't see the sense anymore to go anywhere or to pretend that they have to be secret or underground, because really it wasn't happening anymore. Even though in 1988, and again it always shows where the lines of tolerance were, they staged a demonstration at the Gogol monument on the boulevard. And what is interesting is actually a film that exists. Somebody filmed that event, and they are unbelievably, it just says, they have a poster saying all people of the world are brothers, and something about free speech. And the hatred they get from the general public is quite astonishing, and that is in 1988. And then actually the militia arrives and they're all bundled into cars and actually quite badly beaten. But of course the things develop incredibly quickly, and before they know it there's no Soviet Union anymore. And the Systema sort of first in the early 90s develops and flourishes. There are big squads, for example in the Neharosha Kvartiere, the Bulgakov Museum, that was a whole attic filled with bohemians of all kinds. But it fizzles out, both because of poverty and because there is nowhere to define again. And what it really shows actually is that, coming back to the sort of original theme of love, peace and developed socialism, that of course, rather than a contradiction, it was a symbiosis. The Systema could only happen and exist against the background of that slightly imperfect developed socialism. The places like the Saigon, the Casa, all these cafes, they could not have access in a capitalist world where every cafe is branded. They needed a sort of kind of bland space in order to project their own vision on it. The economic situation, as the hippies in the 90s learned, but actually a lot of them died. A lot of them at the hand of violent crime because, of course, their drug routes, which were never quite without danger, now suddenly become huge profit mafia business. And people just simply get shot and beaten up and drowned in the same lifestyle they used to have. And however, in the Soviet Union, of course, it was illegal, but it wasn't dangerous, and not to that extent. And of course, you could in developed socialism, you collected 10 bottles a day, and that was enough for buying yourself a meal at a canteen, which of course is something that is changing in the 90s too. So, in a very harsh way, the Systema learns that actually, even though it survived developed socialism, it couldn't live without it. Yep.
Thank you. We have some time for questions.
Thank you. It's really great to hear more about your work. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the kind of afterlives of these people, how the experience of having participated in the system has kind of influenced the later lives of people. Because, for example, the hippies that I've interviewed in Romania and Yugoslavia, the fact that we were hippies once, that we resisted is the absolute center of these people's lives, and everything else about their lives is colored by the fact that once we were hippies. So I was wondering how that translates into your experience.
Yeah, that's I mean, actually, again, and one can see that generational divide quite well. The very early hippies, these privileged youngsters who really brought hippie into Moscow, they went out of it almost seamlessly. Especially the ones who came from privileged backgrounds. For example, Stas Namin, who is the grandson of Anastas Mikoyan, he was a hippie, and then he creates a group of sweet tea flowers, and he gets those legitimate, and he has success, and now he's this huge producer. And I mean, when I went to see him in Moscow, he had on the wall, he had pictures of him and Julia Roberts, and him and Leonardo DiCaprio, and clearly the hippies, being a hippie, that was sort of, I was there for the girls, he said. And that was just one drop in his life. And I think that would be true for somebody like Masha Stapnitzer. Vasily Stalin died, even though, I mean, of course, they're the ones like Sons and Ophelia who actually they never left it, and they all died in the 90s of various reasons. Those who survive and are of the second generation, yeah, for them it's the central moment of their life. And of course, it is partly because it is their youth, it's before, even though of course a lot of them refuse to grow up. So it has something to do with they're now in failing health. They live in a state which is not very good in looking after its old people, and certainly not very good in looking after people who are on the margins of society. So that they were on the margins then, but the margins looked a lot better then. So a lot of them actually are in pretty dire shape. And there's an interesting thing, I mean, obviously, the ones in Russia are in the worst shape. The ones in the Baltics, actually, they had another groundbreaking event. They had independence, which they supported mostly heavily, even though it's interesting, both Misha Bombin and Sasha Domidotov, who were the two leading hippies in Riga and Tallinn, respectively, then became big human rights for the Russian community. They had both Russian roots, and they became activists for the rights of Russians in the Baltic states. So. But they look at it back wistfully, but not in that sort of desperation I sometimes feel among the hippies who remained in Moscow and Leningrad, St. Petersburg. And then of course there's the group who went to Israel, and that's a sort of different breed again, because they had a completely life-changing event, and they look back on it as the one positive moment in their Soviet life, as sort of what rescues Sovietness for them. So there's a different path, but the one you describe, I would say, is probably the most common.
Thank you, Juliane. And just follow up on your question, actually. I was sort of marginally associated with the system in Leningrad, and spent time in Galia and Boston.
Okay.
and with 3 blocks from Sivan. But speaking of afterlife, I was drafted into the army in 1986. Came back in '88, and it was amazing how everything had changed. It was a completely different world, you know. The whole system was really gone. And also, I was surprised to find out how many of us were Jewish. Something I had not been aware of before, because of my background. I'm Jewish, but not being particularly aware of it. A lot of people left. Also, you know. And it's interesting that in Jerusalem, in the early 1990s, some of these people sort of reconstituted themselves in semi-art sort of hippie community, and that also fizzled out. You know, eventually people moved on to Canada, here in the United States. But it's remarkable how Perestroika sort of killed the system.
I mean, it's interesting that the internet, it has resurrected it to a certain extent, because there's now a virtual Systema, which actually then translates again. So the 1st of June is actually still celebrated in Moscow and Tsaritsyn, and people come mostly from Moscow, but from all parts of the Soviet Union, and meet on the 1st of June. Now, actually, I went for the first time last year and had the bad luck that actually much fewer people came, because the community has now completely split over the Ukraine conflict between the what they call the liberals and the imperialists, and it's not as quite as, I mean, internationalism was definitely understood in different ways by different people.
Okay, well, you're talking about my generation. I mean, really, I think I'm the oldest person here. This is exactly my generation. And I went to Reed College on the West Coast, and the free speech movement was going when I was at university, and there were, you know, Volkswagens going up and down the West Coast and being part of the free speech movement, so this was really, you know, my years. So I went to the Soviet Union for the first time in 1966, and I carried with me an album of the Mamas and the Papas, and I thought this was going to be really great. And I arrived in Kiev, and I met immediately, of course, a bunch of, I don't know if they were hippies, but they were certainly black marketeers. And you know, I gave them my records and so on, and they hadn't heard of it. You know, that was interesting. So of course, but this is the kind of transit we're talking about. That people are bringing in new stuff. But so my questions really are about the 1980s. First, I just wanted to say that, you know, you sort of rushed through here from 1988 to 91, and we still have to remember that nobody knew the Soviet Union was going to fall apart, right? And that the surveillance apparatus was still working, right? And so my most hippie friends from 87, 88, when I spent a full year there, they told me one thing that I still remember. It's sort of perfectly, you know, iconic, and that is they had participated in many of the peace hand-holding campaigns and so on, Baltics and so on, and they made friends with some probably people my age from Seattle, and who were hippies from that time. And the friend's name was Little Dove, you know, Little Dove somebody. And in 1988, they wanted to explain to me, you know, how Soviet KGB worked. And they showed me a letter. And the letter had a return address on it. And it was from Little Dove and, you know, her partner from Seattle. And it said in the letter, "We're coming to Moscow, and we'd love to see you. And we're going to arrive on something like, you know, November 15th. And they said, and when do you think we, and we're leaving on November, it's a short visit, and we're leaving on November 22. And they said, well, when do you think we got that letter? November 23. Okay, it had been sent in September. It had been in the hands of the KGB, and obviously, and then, you know, they deliver it the day after. That sort of heart-wrenching little bit of sort of Soviet surveillance, which was the kind of thing that sent you a message. We can make you feel bad, not just you know, you don't get to see your friends, but we make you feel bad. Well, my question, though, really have to do with the overlap with the art and the religion scenes, because that art exhibit just, you know, rang so true that you showed. The sort of underground, not very, you know, not very professional art, or not really part of the high art scene. So my question is, was there any intersection? I mean, you've talked a lot about the intersection with the political scene, where there is this uneasy relationship, and I'm sure you could say a lot more about, you know, the high dissidence of these folks. But what about the artists and poets and so on? My friends were kind of amateur artists. They were part of, and this I think is really important here, the Jewish and then the religious sect aspect that continued through the 1980s. But they definitely felt that they were part of a kind of underground art scene. But it's not the underground art scene that we all learned about, you know, later, where people really made it into the international scene. So,
no, I mean, they're all, I mean, this is why it's always actually so difficult also to say where, to what extent, where does my research end? Yes. Because they're all linked to a larger underground, but even the term underground is in many ways problematic, because the underground, as for example in that exhibition, goes overground, is intrinsically linked to the mainstream, but is still somehow separate. But this sort of world of, and it really assembled all sorts of strange people, because by being much of being outside, they quite often were thrown together. Not only, I mean, bizarre encounters, I mean, psychiatric hospitals, who was treated for mental deficiency. The official diagnosis for Hippie was schizophrenia, as it was for dissidents. and as it was for people with pathological personalities, and all of them ended up together in the same ward in the psychiatric hospital where they all met, and they had ample of time to discuss their lives. And they also then met on the outside again. So actually, just like, I mean, the point has been made about camps, Gulag, that of course it's a big, it's a sort of alternative network of relations, and that of course happened in this instance too. So the drugs dealers, the fatsovshiki, the underground artists, the underground writers, the just sheer do-nothing people, all of that circulated in interlinked circles. In some cities like Leningrad, they really circulated all in the same place because they all drifted in and out of the Saigon. And therefore the scene in Leningrad is a little bit different to the one in Moscow, where they were more they were intersecting, but the hippies, for example, had in Moscow very much their own spaces where they would go. It was just a bigger place. I mean, you feel always nervous, and I know there's a witness in the room. But I mean, in Leningrad, I've still not got my head around the Leningrad scene because it is so impossible to say where to stop. The underground art, yes, of course, and that's sort of one of the problems. Is it? I mean, people thought it was terribly interesting, but I'm sure artistically not all of it was top-notch, and certainly, I mean, the hippies painted in their typical psychedelic world, which seems to be, without them having seen, I think, hippie art from America very much, maybe drugs just induced the same kind of style of painting all over the world, but it's remarkably similar. And some of them probably were very talented, and part of the problem is, of course, there was no outlet where they could develop. They were thrown together, they had no real, I mean, actually the music, and because the music, of course, not only came as the music per se, it came with the words and it came with the cover, so there was actually both a visual and an audio and a sensual transfer of knowledge. I think with art it was much more difficult than many of these underground artists say. We just literally had no idea of where the art world was in the West. And that just all comes in the 1990s. And so I think there is a difference. And I guess because so much of that statements, I don't know if the hippies really saw, if Wolosi saw themselves really as artists primarily. They saw themselves as people. The one common factor is that there was a sort of implicit rejection of the written word. And it wasn't that the hippies didn't write, but compared to previous non-conformist generations in the Soviet Union, who very much relied on the written word, so the whole Samizdat and Syntax and Phoenix and all these journals were called, that was something the hippies did not, and very consciously did not want to participate in. So they all wrote poetry in their little klishki, but there seems to have been no real sense of wanting to put that into a form which then would circulate among people. It was very oral. So there was something called the telega, or the telegi, which is the sort of kind of stories. And that was basically how information was relayed. And it was oral, of course, because it was safer, but also I think it was a rejection of the written word, and it felt also closer to nature. And of course the hippie movement all over the world had that sort of sense of wanting to be more natural in that sense. And I think seeing the book and the printed word was seen very much as a sort of production of official culture. But of course, for every generalization, you find exceptions. There were hippies who were very much writers and who wanted to become writers, and then there were people who were very much involved in the dissident movement. Even though there was, in general, the hippies disdained the dissidents. They thought there were people who were pursuing a cause which was pointless. And this is why they called themselves apolitical, because the political ones were the dissidents who were fighting against windmills, and their line was, we just don't participate. And in general, there was even a certain type of hostility towards the dissidents. But again, yeah, in general, at best, there are some people who were linked, but few. And then, of course, in the 80s, it also changed. And
so, I really enjoyed this talk. I have two small questions. One, in the West, of course, the hippies are reacting largely to the draft, which is something new. And the draft, as you mentioned, is a huge part of this. I was wondering what the men did in terms of military service and how they got out. I assume the schizophrenia is part of it. And then two, I was wondering if, in Leningrad in particular, about the relationship between the hippies and the Mitski.
So the draft, yes. I don't know what came first, if they were diagnosed as schizophrenic and therefore not sent to the army, or if they realized that if they would try to act schizophrenically, they would end up in the hospital and get basically out of the army. But that really was the standard response. If you hadn't already been hospitalized by sheer virtue of being a hippie and therefore been declared schizophrenic, you could do things which would make you get hospitalized. So I have a guy who sat himself down on Gorky Street and cut up all his arms in the middle of the road, and that got him into the local psychiatric hospital and out of the army. The problem, of course, was, which they then, I think, only learned in the 1990s, that gave them it was in the passport that they were schizophrenic, and that they were not, often it meant they were not considered, they didn't have to work, but also meant they wouldn't get work if they wanted to, except for boiler room, etc. So it actually put them, what was meant to create them a space of freedom, actually put them into a category which then could become, under the right circumstances, very restrictive. So it was a very double-edged sword. Initially, in the very early days, some people did go to the army. So in fact, both Sonze and a couple of his friends did go to the army, and either they came back and then stopped being hippie, or they came back and just resumed where they had stopped. Supposedly, in the army you could get a lot of good records, and the music was flowing freely. So the second part of your question was?
The Leningrad Mitski.
Yeah, the Mitki. There seems to be very little direct contact between the Leningrad hippies and the Mitki, except I'm sure they knew each other because they're all in the Saigon. What I always find is that their response to the system is the same. And I found Alexei Yurchak speaks about the Mitki and says, in many ways, of course, this complete rejection of the system was also a sort of complete acceptance. And I think that's so true of the hippies too. By completely giving up the fight and saying, we're not going to reform, we're not going to engage, we're not going to, in a way they accepted, of course, society as it is. In many ways they accepted it more than the people who railed against lines and red lines, and because, as I said, the Systema was very craftfully organized around the way how developed socialism really worked. You found the weak spots and you exploited them, and that meant you could live to a certain extent. And it was only when sort of shifts were taking place. For example, when Nixon came to Moscow in '72, a lot of people were collected and sent to the army to clean the streets. When the Olympics came in 1980, the same happened again. So as long as the system was in balance, everybody has sort of carved out that space. And in many ways it actually means that they were conformist in their non-conformism. And that, I think, unites them with the Mitki. I think they're sort of, personally, they're sort of linked one or two. The Mitki, in terms of style, were more like beatniks. I mean, they took neglect into their personal hygiene as well. While the hippies actually were very proud of being quite clean and having their hair was beautiful. There was sort of, the cult of beauty was at least one of the strands. There were a couple of people who were not into the beauty culture.
I want to go off of your first question, relating to the question of military service in the draft, because one of the titles is about peace. And ostensibly, during most of the period you're talking about, the Soviet Union was at peace. At least they were not actively engaged in a war in the way the U.S. was embroiled in Vietnam, which was so important for the hippie movement. But you mentioned '79 and the Olympics, that also coincides with the invasion of Afghanistan. So I wanted to ask about how did the Afghanistan invasion affect the system at all? Did it help galvanize the movement? Did it bring in people who, again, wouldn't normally have sort of fallen into the sphere of sort of hippiedom?
Surprisingly little, I would say. Very few people even mention Afghanistan unprompted. I always ask, and then they sort of say, yeah, of course you were against it, but it's very much an afterthought. And the idea of what pacifism means is actually also one which is sort of an interesting one to explore. So especially in the early hippies, it wasn't, it's sort of, pacifism is a nice idea for the world, but certainly did not apply to you when somebody like a Komsomol patrol or, working class youth would attack you, and then you would actually have quite violent fights where hippies would hit back hard. The second wave, the ones we sort of saw meditating, they were more into that sort of classical pacifism idea, and also probably have a closer to the understanding of love as this sort of kind of all-encompassing charity as was once the idea in the Western hippies in the late 60s. So it's actually, it arrived in a funny way almost, the music and the look came first, the ideology arrived almost 6 years later. But Afghanistan has always puzzled me. Then of course once the Afghans return, there's a certain recognition that one is related. They did not become part of the Systema, but that there was a certain protest. Of course, the Afghans also started to have these art collectives, which produced the same kind of underground art, which the hippies partly did. So there were meeting points, but it really was more like touching rather than integrating.
Can I just,
yeah.
I have a couple more questions. Yeah, you mentioned so it's the aesthetics that came first, and that along with the fact that the hippie movement was so grounded in the elite is extremely reminiscent, as you alluded to, of the Studiati. So I'm wondering, you know, how do we differentiate this from the as this, you know, how do you make the system more?
If you read the chapter of my book, you will see that the Studiati actually were not elitist, despite, I mean, it was the same dynamic.
It's the same generation, or is that the generation? It's the same social origin.
No, that is actually is a misconception which comes about because there's actually so few things about the Studiati. I mean, it has the dynamic as in the hippies of that elite youth was part of the transmission belt, but actually the real transmission belt for the Studiati was the war. So it was a much returning soldiers who brought back jazz records, the Voice of America, which was accessible to anybody who had a radio. So there was a much broader basis, and again in the hippies too. I mean, I concentrated on Moscow because in many ways it's the most interesting story, but there were hippies coming about independently, not knowing about Moscow at all at the same time. So what we didn't have in the Studiati is the Soviet press being favorable initially, so there isn't this sort of tension between what is to make of this movement. And then the Studiati have, at the heart of Studiati is consumption. You consume fashion, you consume music, and the few hippies who sort of graduate from Studiati, for example, Greenberg in Riga, he's first really a Studiati, he calls himself a dandy, but it's sort of, but it's all about looking above your station. It's looking fashionable, and it's basically an exaggerated form of consumption, while the hippies, and very early on, that anti-materialist nature is in the Soviet Union as well, despite the fact that, of course, it's more in complicated surroundings, given that the society isn't terribly materialistic itself. But there are certain elements, of course, especially of late socialism, and again, this is why hippies would not have been able to come about in the post-war period. The post-war period, where really there was real poverty happening, the Studiati were the logical counter-cultural response, and you wanted to look different, and by looking different meant looking better, looking more elegant. Of course, by the 70s, people looked decent. They didn't look fashionable, and in many provincial towns, they still, for our eyes, looked pretty poor, but not for what Soviet people themselves would think of themselves. And in fact, I have this very nice picture of a hippie getting married in Leningrad, and the sax lady has this enormous hairdo, which in the 50s would have been completely Stiliaga, and she has this very nice suit, and then there are these hippies where basically the husband and the wife are exactly the same, with long hair and jeans. And of course, the reaction is against a certain bourgeoisification. So there is definitely that one can say in terms of being countercultural trends, of course they have things in common, but in terms of the actual content, they're quite different, and also the way how it plays out then as a counterculture in the Soviet Union is different, but it's a longish answer.
I also had a question about the Studiati, about how right now there's a lot of like nostalgia for it, and that the movie Studiati came out, and they have kind of a lot of like Studiati themed like parties and everything. What about Systema? Is that at all in kind of current culture in the former Soviet Union? Do people kind of have any kind of nostalgia for it? I mean, young people, do they ever do anything?
For the hippie movement?
Yeah, or just kind of like, I mean, with Studiati, like, obviously the people who are going to all the parties are all very young and weren't around during it. But I was just wondering kind of what the connotation is.
The Styliani revival is really interesting, and it's interesting in conjunction that the guy who did the Styliani movie also did a movie about hippies, actually.
Okay.
It's called Dom Sonsa, and it's a very idealized version of Sonsa. Sonsa really himself was supposedly incredibly charismatic, and he had sort of 5 women on every finger. And he was so bad, and in the end, some other hippie stabbed him in 1973, almost mortally wounding him. And so it wasn't all. But in the movie, he is this very thoughtful guy who sacrifices himself, and who this girl who is a sort of society girl falls in love with him and runs away. So same concept as with Styliani.
Yeah.
People from 2 different worlds meet each other. What is going to happen? Interestingly, it did not result in a hippie revival or hippie parties. And I think it must be that in the end, hippies are still countercultural for this now Russian mainstream, while Styliani aren't really. Styliani is a retro fad, but it's perfectly, it's funny to go down in a petticoat down Bond Street, while becoming an alternative, well, there is a big alternative scene. I mean, in fact, the 1st of June in Tsaritsyn is by now, there's like about 100 old hippies, and then there are 2,000 young hippie alternatives. But it's very much an alternative culture. Well, if you're a nice girl studying at NU and you think, oh, let's go to a Styliani party, no problem. If you're a nice girl and you go to Tsaritsyn on the 1st of June, where everywhere in the woods the police is hanging out and the smell of marijuana is hanging over most of it, it's a little bit less respectable. So.
Oh, you mentioned that in the concert that was staged to be in Palace Square in Petersburg, was supposed to be Pugacheva too, which makes me wonder, what other local cultural production were they into? Were they into like soy and quinoa?
I think the Pugacheva element was the one which came from the official. But the interesting thing is, according to one of my, they went into the bars. That's a really interesting one. Very few. Some people went to the bars, but really, as a rule, you were either a lover of rock or you were a lover of bardish music, and there seems to have been very little overlap. And that is really, again, where there's one of the fault lines between youth and the sort of 1970s more popular music-oriented youth. I think Pugacheva held an interesting spot. So, for example, somebody like Kremenchikov said, I very much rate Pugacheva. And since he was the god of alternative music, he is the leader of Aquarium, and Aquarium was the one band which was never recognized as official and could never go legit, and therefore very much kept that aura of being the voice of the young generation. And he wrote a song about the generation Pakalinia, so that very much encapsulated that feeling of that whole world where they all basically lived a life which they sort of knew was underneath their potential, but this is the life they wanted because it gave them that spaces of freedom. And so I think Pugacheva actually, and I'm sort of waiting for somebody to pick her up as a topic, I think she is a more complicated person, both musically and personally. So she was actually friendly with these people. She knew Kremenchikov and she knew Makarevich from Machina Vremeni, and of course Machina Vremeni had gone legitimate. So and the guy, one of the guys I interviewed about this riots in the concert, they said, well, we were shouting down with the regime, etc. But the guys who really went for it, they were the working class lads, and they really were disappointed because they couldn't see Pugacheva, and that was the. And I don't know. I mean, if this is an embellishment of a good story, but she. Again, the line between official culture and non-official one is not clearly drawn. I mean, as I said, Machina Vremeni by 1979 had become an official band who was contracted by Melodia, and that lowered their status a little bit in the eyes of alternative youth, but they were still listened to. And then, of course, somewhere in the late 80s, Aquarium took off and became, I mean, they didn't become officially official, but they were sent around tours, and I think they were even sent to the States. And it all becomes, in that period, it becomes sort of difficult to say actually who is on what side. And that is actually what kills the Systema, because the Systema relies on clearly drawn front line, which is why it couldn't really develop until about the mid-70s, when it was clear that it would be repressed, because before there was repression, it was all a sort of more amorphous collection of people.
Are you familiar with the volume Systemification?
Sorry?
Systemification.
Yeah, I do know that. In fact, one of the editors is my PhD student for myself.
Speaking of nostalgia.
Yeah, you probably know her, Anna Khan.
Yeah.
Do you want to say a little bit more about the religious aspect, because and where it came in or not? Because of course those figures with the crosses are, very evocative, and this, I saw this more as in the 1980s with going for all kinds of religious sects and so on, and of course, and half the people who were doing them were claiming to be Orthodox were Jewish, but but the followers of Alexander Min and lots of other, charismatic cult figures. This seemed to be part of the counterculture. But I don't know how it intersects with these.
Oh, completely. I mean, I think what unites them is they're seekers. They're people who seek something different in the Soviet Union because there's such a strong counterpole that can all unite under something like the Systema or without having to think too much of how they're actually different. But so very early on, the ecumenical movement is deeply interlinked with the hippies. A lot of hippies went to the ecumenical movement. The leaders from the ecumenical movement had dabbled in the hippie movement. And then later on, the Orthodox Church arrives. It strikes me always a little bit of, it's like the Eastern mysticism. It's very appealing, but for example, there were always these mass baptisms in Gaia, the summer camp. And then there are people who say, oh yeah, I got baptized 4 times, every summer I go and get baptized. And you think, I wonder what the Orthodox Church would have to say about that. But then the people who go, they almost seem to find pleasure in the rigidness of the official church, and actually go away and become monks. And that is sort of their trajectory out of the hippie movement. Then there are people like Alexander Agorotnikov, who actually also was a hippie, and his commune was actually a hippie commune, which was an Orthodox commune. And therefore he was a little bit apart from the Systema, but they knew, I mean, they were sort of linked. And then there were the mystics who sort of practiced Eastern religion. I think because people were so busy finding the morsels of information, there wasn't this much question of, nobody ever questioned if you said, I'm now going religious. People were like, oh yeah, okay, today you're religious, tomorrow you're into drugs. It's all very much less affair. The guy who runs now the St. Olaf Church in Tallinn, the priest, he was a really big hippie, and he used to be into one of the very early drugs, which was a cleaning agent called Sopal, which basically people sniffed, and he was always high on Sopal, and then one day he had saw Christ in and he stopped Sopal and he became a religious, and people just thought he had changed his drug, and it took them a long time before they sort of accepted it. But I think it was all sort of seen as part of that movement. Either you seek it by smoking opium, or you seek it by carrying the cross, and it wasn't part of the ethos was you didn't ask too many questions. You didn't ask about name, you didn't ask where you come from, you didn't ask when you were born, you didn't ask what your parents did. And this is partly my problem. I mean, I'm working with these interviews and I say, so who was it? When was he born? Where did he come from? What year was it? And nobody, it's all very vague.
Damn hippies.
A history out of Plato.
Really, how tolerant were they of queer sexualities and all that?
Yeah, interesting.
Was that talked about at all?
Yeah, it was, because after the 1971 demonstration, they got kicked out from the Psychodrome because it was Moscow State University, and they also they thought Gorky Street was too dangerous, so they started assembling in front of the Bolshoi Theater, which was also the assembly place for the sort of homosexual community. And I've always been very interested in that, and I have interviewed people on both sides. So the homosexuals claim they liked the hippies because they were pretty, and they sort of thought it was sort of an interesting addition to the community, and they would talk, but they wouldn't intermingle. The hippies are more negative, I would say. I mean, some of them very violently negative, but most of them say we coexisted, but they were dangerous. I mean, and it's not quite clear. It's mixed in if they thought personally and subjectively they were dangerous because they were abnormal, or because, of course, they did something which was a criminal act. While the hippies this is of course, except if they took narcotics, actually couldn't be sentenced under anything under the legal code. So and in the end, after about a year at Watershed, they moved back on Gorky Street and the two communes separate again. I've asked, every time I ask if there were homosexuals in the hippie movement, and the answer is always no, which I'm sure is not true. But it certainly, it was a tolerant place, but it didn't extend to that. And then also when you dig deep, so I always ask the people who emigrate to Israel if they experience anti-Semitism, and they usually say no, and then they usually dig up one episode of somebody. It's a surface, a pretty large surface of it's all fine. And then underneath, of course, like in any society, I mean, the other thing is sexual violence, which also is very difficult to get to, but I know people have been raped within the hippie community among hippies, and it's sort of then passed as free love. But I'm sure actually something that happened in the Western hippie communities too. But it's another sort of something which I think part of the reason of why the Soviet hippie community could exist for so long is because they had learned not to talk about things, and they lacked the vocabulary to talk about things. So they even, I mean, in terms of feminism or homosexuality or even race, they lacked a vocabulary to address these issues other than stating facts. You're Jewish, or and quite often the anti-Semitic incidents would involve the word Žid, which was considered unacceptable, but was used, or Galabui. But beyond that, there was no word to problematize it. And I think this is sort of, when in the 70s, when one looks at the Western hippie community, they fragment into these different groups of ecological warriors, or feminists, or they go to communal life. But it is because there's more of a discourse, because the discourse happens from all sorts of corners. But the discourse, of course, in this moment even is frozen. There's no introduction of new words. And I think this freezes the hippie community too, and they exist as they actually are, pretty much the same from the mid-70s to the late 80s. So when in the West there are no more hippies anymore, there is this 1,000 headstrong hippie community in the Soviet Union who sort of know that in the West there are no more hippies, but they are still there.
So since you mentioned that cleaning agent, so
yeah.
one of the words that you used in one of your answers but never really popped up during the presentation was psychedelic. You said, you know, they happened to produce art that was strikingly similar to what Western groups were producing. But the question is, were they using hallucinogens? Did they have people cooking up acid?
Oh yeah, they cooked all sorts of really bad things, and because most of it was self-done, it could be lethal. So yeah, there was always marijuana and grass, and then there was this sopal, then there was something called Cicladol, which was tabletki, which you could actually get prescription-wise in the pharmacy. Then there was something which they got later in the 80s and killed actually quite a lot of them, which names just escapes me now, but that was where they literally cooked it up. And somebody who was a chemist basically invented it, but it was all compared to drug dealing or drug take. I mean, there were some big druggies. Interestingly, nobody actually died of the drug itself except for 1 or 2 people I know, and that was already in the 90s when everything had become stronger. But there are people, for example, the group around Ophelia, who actually were probably ideologically some of the more interesting groups in the hippie movement. And then after a while, one can realize they travel around, but they only travel around according to the opium season. So they go to Lvov, and they go to Central Asia, and they go around Moscow. And actually their life, which is supposedly, the traveling is supposedly their sense of freedom, but actually it's chasing the drug. So there are people who are gradually ruined by drug taking, but it isn't sort of like New Jersey, Orange County, where sort of you have people shooting each other over. The drug dealing was always a little bit more benevolent in that sense.
But it's mostly opioids, not like psychotropics.
No, it's opium, which you get from Central Asia, but funny enough also seem to grow Port Moskwy, and Lvov was, I don't know, was somewhere there. But it seems to have in the circle, so you go to Port Moskwy, then you go to Lvov, and then later in the year you go to Central Asia. That's the 3 stops. You maybe?
Quickly, connect actually a question about the gas and then drug use.
And then I will wrap up.
The use of drug, marijuana, opium shut up after the invasion of Afghanistan. And there was direct connection between the military experience and the drug use. Well,
even though the map was there long before that, actually, I was amazed.
Central Asia.
Yeah, it always came from Central Asia, but so
it was heroin.
it wasn't heroin, no, it was opium. Heroin only came actually after 1991, really. I mean, I don't know if they were single. And LSD also didn't make it. So there was no real import. It was all
And mushrooms become big in the late 90s.
Yeah, the mushrooms there already, but that is something most hippies discovered and when they come to the West. So the Israeli hippies, they're all big into their mushrooms.
And they had them all the time and they didn't know.
Yeah, there were actually drug-taking communities, even for example among students who didn't seem to be hippies. So some hippies tell me how they get invited by a friend to a birthday party and everybody is shooting up and he's like, I would have nothing to do with it. So anecdotally there seems to have been communities taking drugs as early as the late 60s, and actually I found documents sort of supporting that. Partly because in Central Asia it was sort of tolerated for all people because it was seen as part of their custom, but that meant that the fields were always sort of tolerated, and that then of course opened the opportunity.
Okay, thank you. This has been it was wonderful talk and a great discussion. I'd like to thank you once again for coming here and sharing your work with us.
Thank you.
Now, avoid the Halloween rush.